All right, today we're tackling a really provocative theory, one that tries to explain the hidden origins of our entire modern world.
So let's just jump right in with a massive question, one that historians and political scientists have debated for ages. Why Europe? Why did our modern world of nations, of borders, of international law, why did all of that arise there and not somewhere else? Well, one thinker, a sociologist named Naoki Komuro, came up with a pretty radical answer. He said, forget politics, forget economics, the real answer is buried in a 1,500-year-old debate about God.
Okay, so to really get what he's arguing, we need to rewind the clock. I mean, way back, to a time before countries even existed, a world that looked totally different from ours. You know, there's a great line from the source material that sums this up perfectly. First, there was Europe. The nations came later. So long before you had a place called France or a place called Spain, there was this shared idea of a single European civilization. But what was holding it all together? Because it definitely wasn't governments or borders.
Well, the glue was this concept called the Corpus Christianum. That's Latin for the Christian body. This was the idea that all Christians were part of one single, universal community. What united them wasn't a king or a passport, but the Catholic Church, a common culture, and this shared faith that went way beyond any local politics.
And this table, wow, it really drives home just how different that world was from ours. Think about it. In medieval Europe, your loyalty wasn't to one country. You could be a knight who swore an oath to a lord in what we now call France, and another one in England at the same time. Borders were blurry, constantly shifting, and law? It wasn't something a government just made up. It was seen as ancient, unchanging custom. Now, compare that to the modern state, which is all about clear borders, absolute power, what we call sovereignty, and demanding your one single national loyalty.
So that's the big question, right? How did Europe make that massive leap from this fluid, faith-based world to the one we know today, with its rigid borders and powerful states? Well, according to this theory, the whole thing hinges on a really unique feature, something right at the heart of European Christianity.
And it all starts right here. The year is 451 AD at the Council of Chalcedon. This council was called to settle a huge, raging debate, and they came up with a foundational piece of dogma. Jesus was both fully human and fully God. Now that might sound like some pretty abstract theology, but according to Komuro, this single decision kicked off the entire chain reaction that created our modern world. Seriously. So you're probably asking, okay, why is that so important? Well, think it through. If Jesus, who walked the earth as a human, is also the all-powerful God who created the entire universe and all its laws, then his words, the things he said that were written down in the Gospels, they become the absolute, ultimate divine revelation. His teachings are everything. And this is where we get to the absolute core of the argument. You look at the Christian Gospels, and what do you find? Parables, moral teaching, stories. But what you don't find is a specific, detailed legal code for how to run a society. Commands like enter by the narrow gate are all about your inner self, your soul. And that's a massive contrast with, say, the Torah in Judaism or the Quran in Islam. Those texts are filled with comprehensive laws that cover everything from business deals to daily life. They are, in a way, a blueprint for how a society should function on the outside. The source material really hammers this point home, saying, and I'm quoting here, the Gospels could not become a source of law. They do not give birth to fundamental social norms or precepts. It's just not what they're for. And this creates what the author calls a fundamental split. You have the inner world, your soul, your faith, your salvation, and Christianity has that covered. But then you have the outer world, politics, business, law, all the day-to-day stuff. And that world was left in a kind of legal vacuum. There was no divine law coming from the Gospels to tell people how to organize it. Okay, so to really highlight just how unique this European situation was, the author brings in a really powerful counterexample. The argument goes like this. In Islam, this so-called legal vacuum just never happened. Why? Because the Quran, along with the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, provides a complete system, Sharia law, which weaves together religion, law, and social life into one seamless whole.
This table really lays out the key differences, according to the theory. For Christianity, the Gospels aren't a law book, and that leads to that separation between the inner and outer worlds. In Islam, the Quran is the first source of law, so those worlds are unified. And here's a crucial point. Jesus is seen as God, which makes his non-legal teachings absolute. In Islam, Muhammad is the final and most important prophet, but he is a human, delivering God's complete legal and social plan for humanity to follow.
And you can see this integration perfectly in the 5 pillars of Islam. These aren't just abstract beliefs. They are concrete actions, required duties for every believer.
I mean, think about them. Declaring your faith, praying 5 times a day, fasting during Ramadan, giving to charity, making the pilgrimage to Mecca, these are all outward, observable, physical actions. They completely fuse faith with everyday behavior. There's no split between an inner, religious life and an outer, secular one.
Okay, so let's recap. We have this unique situation in Christian Europe, this legal vacuum in the outer world. But how in the world does that lead to nation-states and international law?
Right, let's connect those dots. It seems like a paradox, doesn't it? How does a religion without a legal code somehow end up creating the most complicated legal system on the planet?
Okay, here's the causal chain the author lays out. Step 1, you've got that legal vacuum. The outer world of politics and business has no divine law. Step 2, somebody has to fill that vacuum, right? So European thinkers dust off ancient non-religious Roman law and bring it back to govern the secular sphere. Now you have a legal system totally separate from the church. Step 3, this is huge. Kings start to say, hey, my authority over this secular world and its laws is absolute. It's godlike. And that's the birth of sovereignty. The king basically becomes a god in his own territory. Step 4, that sovereign power needs a defined space to rule over, so the king's power creates a territory with hard borders and a single unified law. Boom, you have the nation-state. And finally, step 5, once you have a bunch of these new powerful sovereign states all next to each other, they need some rules for how to interact, and that, right there, is international law, a law between equals.
So, if you follow that logic, the entire modern political structure that we live in, nations, borders, international law, all of it, is basically an unintended consequence. It all rests on this foundation built by a unique religious idea that separated our inner world of faith from our outer world of politics.
And that brings us right back to where we started. That idea of Europe, the Corpus Christianum, it was this unified community, but it was politically and legally undefined. According to the theory, it had to break apart into distinct, legally defined nations because its core religion didn't provide the political rulebook to hold it all together.
And this leaves us with a pretty massive question to chew on. If our entire global system, the one we all navigate every day, is really built on this very unique, very specific theological foundation from just one part of the world, how strong is it really? What does its future hold in a world that's more diverse than ever? A world full of cultures and beliefs that don't necessarily share that same history or that same fundamental split between the inner and outer worlds. It's definitely something to think about.